when Maya, a psychology student, learned about a new course titled Perspectives of Consciousness, she was intrigued by its mystery. No one knew who was teaching it, and it wasn't included in the university's standard curriculum. Maya decided to enroll as the course promised breakthrough approaches and experimental methods. The first class took place in a small, dimly lit auditorium in the basement of one of the university's oldest buildings. All students sat quietly, their faces expressing focus and anxiety. A man in a black suit entered the room without introducing himself, picked up chalk and wrote on the board, "Today, you begin a new understanding of reality." He began his lecture in a monotonous voice that vibrated with strange energy. During the lecture, Maya felt her brain filling with bizarre images and voices. Other students began to subtly mimic each other, as if they were programmed machines. No one asked questions. Everyone just listened and took notes. After the class, Maya felt more exhausted than ever. She returned to her dorm room and tried to recall details of the lecture, but only vague fragments and incomprehensible bits remained in her memory. She tried to talk to her classmates, but all of them responded mechanically and briefly. Maya realized something was very wrong with this course. She decided to conduct her own investigation. Maya went to the library to find out more about the professor, but she found no mention of him in the university's academic records. She approached the dean of the faculty with questions, but he seemed unaware of such a course's existence. This only heightened her suspicions and anxiety. Maya observed other students who attended the course and discovered that their behavior had changed. They became isolated, lost interest in social activities, and exhibited strange uniformity in actions and speech. It became clear to her that this course was doing something to their consciousness. The next day, Maya began to feel the effects of the course on herself. She woke up at night from terrible nightmares where faceless figures pursued her, and her thoughts became increasingly fragmented. She realized she could not continue attending the course, but at the same time, she felt an irresistible urge to find out the truth. Maya gathered a group of classmates who also felt negative changes, and they decided to confront the professor. They met him after the next lecture, but he just smiled and said they could not escape the process that had already begun. That night, Maya decided to sneak into the auditorium where the course was held to find any evidence or indications of the nature of the experiment. She opened the door and found the classroom empty, but the professor's desk was strewn with papers and notebooks. Quickly going through them, she found references to behavior modification and testing new technologies on consciousness. It was research that had gone out of control, and it appeared the professor was using the students as unwitting participants. The found documents included mysterious diagrams and expressions that pointed to influences on the brain at a subconscious level. Maya felt a chill of fear, realizing she had become part of something much bigger and more dangerous. She gathered the documents and hurried to the exit when she heard footsteps. Someone was entering the auditorium, and she needed to quickly hide her presence. As Maya hid behind a row of dusty shelves, her heart pounding, she watched a shadowy figure enter the room. It moved with an eerie calmness, scanning the area as if searching for something or someone. Maya held her breath, trying to stay as silent as possible, her eyes fixed on the figure's slow movements. Every second felt like an eternity, her mind racing with thoughts of what this course had truly been about. The figure approached the desk, pausing at the scattered papers that Maya had left in her haste. It became clear that her presence was suspected. Suddenly, the room's door slammed shut with a loud bang, startling Maya and echoing ominously through the empty auditorium. The figure turned swiftly towards the sound, and in that brief moment, Maya seized her chance to escape. She moved quietly but quickly towards the exit, her steps as light as possible on the cold, hard floor. As she reached the door, she heard a voice, deep and distorted, calling out, You cannot leave what you do not understand. Panic surged through her veins as she frantically pushed against the door, only to find it locked. Trapped, Maya turned back to face the figure, who now stood between her and the only exit. The lights flickered overhead, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. The figure spoke again, its voice cold and unyielding. The experiment needs a conclusion, and you are it, Maya. She backed away slowly, realizing that her curiosity had led her into a trap. The walls of the room seemed to close in on her, the air thickening with dread. The figure advanced, revealing a face obscured by shadows, not quite human, its features twisted in a sinister grin. Maya felt a deep chill as she understood that the professor was no mere academic, but something far more malevolent. He continued, "You sought knowledge, and now you shall become part of it. Your consciousness will help us break the barriers of human understanding." Maya's attempts to reason with him were met with cold laughter that echoed through the room. Desperate, Maya looked around for anything to use as a weapon or a tool to escape, but the room was bare, stripped of anything but the chilling remnants of the day's lecture. The figure produced a small device, pressing a button that emitted a low, humming sound. Waves of pain shot through Maya's head, her vision blurring as her knees buckled. She could feel her thoughts slipping away, her own mind betraying her under the influence of the device. As her consciousness faded, Maya's last thoughts were of regret and a piercing sadness for her unfulfilled dreams. The figure watched impassively as she collapsed to the floor, a smile playing on its lips. "A perfect addition to our collective," it murmured, stepping over her to tidy the room for the next day's class. The experiment was concluded, and Maya, once a vibrant and curious student, was now nothing more than a footnote in a dark chapter of psychological exploration. The university remained blissfully unaware of the depths of horror lurking within its walls. The course, Perspectives of Consciousness, was quietly removed from the curriculum, its existence erased like a bad dream. But for Maya and the others ensnared by its promise, the nightmare continued, their minds trapped in an endless cycle of control and manipulation, far from any hope of salvation. The experiment was deemed a success, a terrifying testament to the reach of human curiosity and its potential consequences. In the student town of Springfield University, located far from bustling metropolises, students encountered rumors of a shadow that roamed between dormitories at night, leaving behind traces of horror and missing items. Driven by curiosity and excitement, 4 students, including Emma, who specialized in paranormal phenomena, decided to unravel the mystery. They set out on a nocturnal expedition equipped with flashlights, recorders, and cameras, ready to face the unknown. The night was quiet. Only the wind whispered among the trees, and the moon lit their path with a faint silvery light. Approaching the old sports hall where student life once buzzed, they felt a cold draft that seemed to beckon them onward. The path led them to the oldest dormitory on campus, from where, according to legends, the shadows' journeys began. Suddenly, a vast, almost imperceptible shadow appeared before their eyes, moving with frightening purpose. Instinctively, Emma paused to record the sounds emanating from the shadow. It resembled the whisper of long-forgotten voices. Their camera barely captured the outlines of the shadow when it suddenly vanished around the corner of the building. Spurred by adrenaline and fear, the students followed it, unaware that each step was leading them deeper into a trap. As they passed old doors that suddenly slammed shut with a loud bang, they felt the air grow colder and the darkness thicken with each step. They found themselves in the old part of the dormitory where, according to upperclassmen, students had disappeared without a trace decades ago. The shadow reappeared, this time closer and more defined. Emma and her friends stopped, holding their breath, watching as the shadow slowly turned towards them. Its eyes, if there were any, emitted a cold glow. The shadow whispered words barely audible, but each seemed to drain life from those present. Emma took a step back as the shadow suddenly extended its immense arms towards them, as if trying to take something from them or inviting them into its world. She felt her legs weaken, her heart nearly bursting from her chest. Her friends screamed, but the sound seemed muffled, as if underwater. In the last moment, as the shadow almost touched them, it dispersed like smoke, leaving behind only the echo of its words and a deep, all-encompassing fear. The students, feeling both relief and terror, quickly left the place without looking back. The next day, Emma and her friends discussed the events of the previous night, trying to understand what they had encountered. They decided to delve deeper into the history of those places, but with each discovery, it only became more terrifying. It seemed that the shadow was the spirit of a former student who had disappeared without a trace many years ago, right in that old part of the dormitory. Emma felt that the mystical presence of the girl was still pulling them back, as if trying to tell her story. Deciding not to leave this mystery unsolved, Emma and her team returned to that old part of the dormitory on the last night before heading home for the holidays. They spent the night watching and waiting. She appeared before them again, this time less threatening and more sorrowful. The shadow whispered about injustice and betrayal, about a painful death that had not let her rest. Emma recorded every word, feeling how difficult it was for this soul to find peace. Back in the present, Emma handed the recordings and testimonies to a local historian who promised to help investigate. They hoped to find a way to help the spirit find peace, but the mystery of the shadow in the student town remained open, reminding anyone who dares to step on this land of the dark pages of its history. After the last night in the town, the students began preparing for the winter holidays. They discussed the events, reviewed the recordings, and tried to understand if everything that happened was real. Before leaving, they decided to spend one more night in the same old part of the dormitory. This time, they were better prepared. They brought more flashlights, new batteries for their cameras and recorders. Filled with determination, they set up their equipment and began to wait. The night promised to be cold and quiet, but they knew they might encounter the shadow again. Emma, though feeling fearful, had an unshakable belief that they were doing the right thing. As the clock struck midnight, they began to hear strange sounds. At first, they seemed almost imperceptible, but gradually they grew louder. The sounds resembled whispers mixed with moaning, emanating directly from the walls of the old building. The cameras and recorders were on, capturing these sounds. Emma began to feel her skin crawl with the cold that ran down her spine. She tried to focus on operating the equipment, but her eyes occasionally slid to the dark end of the corridor, where they had last seen the shadow. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the end of the corridor. It was blurry and indistinct, but its presence was palpable. The students froze, watching as the figure approached them. Emma gathered all her courage and asked, "Who are you?" The response came quickly, but it was hard to understand. It sounded like a whisper of the wind, yet one word was clear: vengeance. Emma and her friends exchanged looks, realizing that this might be the spirit of the student they had heard about in the legends. The figure continued to move towards them, and its outlines became clearer. Now they could see that the figure had a feminine form. Her hands were stretched forward, as if she was trying to say something or ask for help. Emma felt this was their chance to help. She addressed the figure. "We want to help you find peace. What do you need?" The figure stopped and seemed to look directly at Emma, her voice becoming clearer. "Truth." That night, they learned the story of injustice and betrayal that led to the tragic death of the student many years ago. She told them how she was accused of a crime she did not commit, and how she died without finding justice. Her spirit had been wandering in search of someone who could tell her true story. Emma recorded everything the spirit told her and promised that they would do everything possible to clear her name. dawn was breaking behind them, and they felt the weight lift from them. As a farewell, the figure smiled, and her image slowly dissipated in the dawn light, like the mist. After that night, when the spirit finally conveyed her story, Emma and her friends experienced mixed emotions. On one hand, they were glad to have helped the spirit, but on the other, they felt an indescribable burden of responsibility. Emma knew they had to tell the world about this tragedy, but she was scared of people's reactions, scared that the spirit might return. She spent the following weeks researching, trying to find evidence of what happened many years ago, but each step proved more difficult than she expected. One evening, after another day spent in archives and libraries, Emma returned to her dormitory exhausted and drained. On her desk, she found an old letter that seemed to have been waiting for her. The letter was written in a thin, anxious handwriting and contained a warning from an unknown person, advising Emma to cease her investigations. At the end of the letter were words that sent chills down her spine. "Some truths are better left in the dark." This message deeply affected Emma, and she spent a sleepless night pondering her next move. The next day, Emma decided to continue her search despite the warning. She was convinced that justice needed to be restored and the story told. She gathered her friends, and they decided to hold a press conference to share their discovery. However, just before the event, Emma felt strange. She had a headache, and her vision became increasingly blurry. Her friends noticed the change, but she insisted on continuing. During the press conference, as Emma was discussing her investigation, she suddenly stopped. Her eyes widened with horror as she saw the figure of the same woman whose spirit they had appeased, standing among the journalists. She was whispering something that no one else could hear, and it caused Emma to faint. She collapsed to the floor, and her friends rushed to help her. Emergency services arrived quickly, but it was too late. Emma died without regaining consciousness, leaving behind many unanswered questions and an unfinished cause. Emma's death sparked many rumors and speculations among the student community and journalists. Many believed she had become the victim of the curse she was trying to uncover. Her friends continued her work, trying to unravel the full story, but without Emma, it was never the same. Her death left a profound impact on everyone who knew her, reminding them of the dark side of seeking truth and justice. In the heart of a university town, at a semester-end party, Alex, a history student, introduced his friends to a mysterious drink. He found the recipe in an ancient book during his work at the university library. The recipe was written on a torn sheet hidden between the pages of a book on mythology and occultism. The campus party was buzzing with excitement, and the students were eager for a new experience. Alex mixed the drink using exotic ingredients required by the recipe, including rare herbs and mysterious spices. After the first sip, the guests felt a strange warmth spreading through their bodies. Soon, the first visions began, each more terrifying than the last. The visions were very realistic and disturbing. Students saw themselves in various scenes of violence and disasters that seemed eerily familiar, as if pulled from the depths of their subconscious. Each vision had a common theme. They witnessed their own deaths. One by one, students who tried the drink started to panic, scream, and beg for help. Alex tried to calm them, but even he couldn't escape his own horrifying visions. The party quickly descended into chaos as everyone tried to escape their hallucinations. The room was filled with an atmosphere of fear that became denser with each passing minute. Despite his fear, Alex tried to understand what was happening. He returned to the book that gave him the recipe, hoping to find some clue or way to stop the nightmares. Reading the book, he found a warning he had not noticed before. The text stated that the drink was used in ancient rituals to summon spirits and open portals to other worlds. Alex realized he had accidentally activated this ritual and now needed to find a way to stop it. He began preparing a counter-ritual, hoping to rectify the situation, but fear and uncertainty continued to drive his actions. Time was running out, and each student who had tried the drink became increasingly panicked and disoriented. Alex quickly prepared the counter ingredients, using every moment to read the book and understand the ritual. He mixed the components, praying that it would stop the terrifying visions. When he finished, he recited the spell noted in the book, hoping for the best. Instead, the atmosphere in the room became even heavier, the air filled with an indescribable energy, and suddenly all the lights went out. When the lights came back on, Alex realized that something had gone terribly wrong. The consequences of the ritual were immediate and terrifying. Alex and all those present realized that the force they had unleashed was far more powerful and malevolent than they had imagined. A cold wind suddenly swept through the room, extinguishing candles and ripping books from the shelves. Doors and windows slammed with such force that glass shattered. The students screamed and clung to each other, seeking protection from the invisible enemy. Alex struggled with his fear, trying to focus and find a way to close the portal he had recklessly opened. He turned again to the book, which now lay on the floor among other scattered items. Quickly flipping through the pages, he found a section on closing portals that required rare components, which fortunately he had with him. He began mixing the ingredients, each time reciting a spell that he hoped would restore everything to its place. With each word, the elements in the room began to subside, but the darkness grew even denser, as if it itself wanted to thwart his plans. Suddenly, amid the chaos, Alex heard a clear female voice calling his name. The voice seemed familiar yet terrifyingly foreign. He looked around and saw a figure standing in the shadow, framed by faint light from behind her. The figure slowly approached, and her eyes glowed with an unearthly light. Alex realized that this was not just any spirit he had summoned, but something ancient and powerful, using a human guise to influence him. He felt his strength waning as the figure began to recite words of a spell. She spoke of a pact made centuries ago between humans and beings from another world. Alex understood that by opening the portal, he had become part of this pact, and now he had to either fulfill its terms or suffer horrific consequences. Despair gripped him as he realized he might lose not only his soul, but also the souls of everyone present. In a final attempt, Alex gathered all his will and strength to stop this creature. He shouted the final spell from the book, hoping it would force the figure to retreat. A battle of wills unfolded around them, where each word from Alex was met with terrifying force from the opponent. For a moment, it seemed he was winning, but then the unexpected happened. Due to a botched spell, the portal expanded, sucking everything around it, including Alex and his friends. The students who remained conscious saw Alex and the figure disappear into a whirl of light and darkness that engulfed the room. The noise subsided, and everything returned to a dreadful silence. They did not know what had happened to Alex or those who disappeared. A sense of loss and uncertainty filled the room. The party was over, but the consequences of that night would stay with them forever, reminding them of the dangers lurking in careless dealings with the unknown. After the failed attempt to stop the entity, Alex and his friends disappeared into the chaos of the expanded portal. The remaining students watched as light and darkness engulfed the room, leaving only an echo of fear behind. All they could do was wait and hope that it would end soon. But when the noise subsided and silence once again dominated the room, it was clear that Alex and the others would not return. The next day, news of the horrific events that had occurred at the party spread throughout the university. Students and faculty could hardly believe what had happened. There was a palpable tension across the campus as everyone sought answers to many questions. Over time, several surviving students began to gather information and evidence, trying to understand how and why it happened. They turned to the book that had been identified as the source of all the troubles and tried to find any information that could explain the situation. The university decided to conduct its own investigation, but all evidence proved fruitless. The book that Alex had found mysteriously disappeared, leaving no trace behind. The university president issued a statement claiming the events were merely the fabrications of students who had consumed too much alcohol. However, the students who had survived that night knew the truth. They felt that something incomprehensible and powerful was still among them. A year later, on the anniversary of the event, several students decided to gather and hold a vigil in memory of their missing friends. They assembled in the same hall where everything had happened. During a silent prayer, one of the students suddenly felt a cold breath on his neck. He turned around and saw the same dark figure standing behind them. A sense of fear and anxiety once again enveloped all those present. That night, another tragedy occurred. 3 students who had participated in the vigil disappeared without a trace. In the morning, their friends found only their belongings scattered around the hall. Soon, talk of a curse that had devastated the lives of those who tried to unravel the mystical events of the previous year began to circulate in the university. With each passing year, the number of victims increased, and no one could understand how to stop this horror. 5 students, Tom, Alice, Mark, Sarah, and James, decided to spend the night in a closed dormitory on the outskirts of their university in a small town in the USA. They had heard legends that this dormitory was the site of numerous accidents and that it was closed due to an extraordinary amount of paranormal activity. Prepared for an adventure, but at the same time a bit apprehensive, they brought along flashlights, a recording device, and a camera, hoping to capture something unusual. Arriving under the cover of darkness, they found the main entrance locked, but Mark, who always carried a set of tools, managed to open the old rusty lock. They entered and immediately felt a bone-chilling cold and the smell of mold filling the air. From their first steps inside the building, it seemed as if they were being watched. James, who was holding the camera, hurried to film the corridor with its peeling paint and faded portraits on the walls. They headed to the common room, where, according to locals, ghosts had been seen. Tom, trying to ease the tense atmosphere, started telling jokes, but his voice seemed muffled and as if absorbed by the emptiness of the old walls. Alice, who was always interested in the paranormal, opened her notebook and began reading aloud stories recorded by former residents about the whispers and screams they heard at night. Her voice echoed, and suddenly everyone heard faint moaning from behind the closed doors at the end of the room. Sarah, the most sensitive of the group, suggested going back, but the others persuaded her to continue. They approached the doors from which the sounds were coming, and Mark carefully opened them. Behind the doors was a dark, impenetrable room. Tom threw a flashlight inside, which reflected light off something unexpected, a corner with glass fragments on the floor. As they entered, the flashlight illuminated an old doll sitting against the wall, its eyes reflecting light, creating an eerie impression. James decided to record the room on video, but suddenly the camera malfunctioned, the screen flickered, and then only showed static noise. All 5 felt a sudden drop in temperature, and the air became heavy. Then they heard footsteps, first soft, but with each minute they grew louder, as if someone or something was approaching them. Everyone froze in place, looking at each other in panic, trying to decide what to do next. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, but before they could sigh with relief, a loud scream appeared. Everyone immediately ran towards the exit, but Sarah tripped and fell, screaming for them to wait. Tom and Alice turned back to help her, but as they were lifting Sarah, Mark, and James, who were almost at the entrance, suddenly disappeared from view along with the flashlight, which fell to the ground and went out. Tom, Alice, and Sarah were left in the dark, calling out the names of their friends, but there was no response. They tried to find their way back to the entrance, but each step was accompanied by strange noises and whispers echoing from every corner. The darkness seemed denser, and the walls of the dormitory appeared to narrow around them, driving them deeper into a trap. Tom, Alice, and Sarah pulled themselves together and decided to search for a way back to the exit, hoping to find Mark and James. They continued along the corridor, their ears strained for every rustle and whisper that arose around them. Each step seemed to last an eternity. Suddenly, from behind one of the doors, a faint light appeared, and they saw the silhouettes of their friends. But as they approached closer, it turned out to be just reflections from glass on the walls, manipulating their expectations. The disappointment of false hope made them stop and regroup. Alice suggested using her recording device to try to capture any sounds or voices that might help them understand what was happening. They decided to sit down and just listen, maintaining complete silence. Within a few minutes, the device captured a series of whispers that seemed connected to the dormitory's history. However, among the whispers, they distinctly heard the word escape. Not knowing whether to trust the voices on the recording, they found the courage to continue moving. They cautiously circled a few more rooms, each exuding a sinister atmosphere. In one room, they found old photographs of former students whose expressions seemed sad and desperate. These faces added an additional layer of horror, as Sarah recognized one of the students as a distant relative who supposedly graduated from this university many years ago. Continuing their exploration, they stumbled upon an archive room filled with old journals and letters written by students several decades ago. Flipping through the pages, Tom found a mention of a secret shared by the students. A place in the dormitory where strange and unspeakable rituals took place. This sparked their desire to find this place, possibly to find answers or even to save their friends. They found an old basement with heavy wooden doors, which were locked with a massive lock. With effort, they opened the doors, and behind them was a dark, damp room with stone walls and low ceilings. In a corner of the room, there was something resembling an altar, surrounded by traces of candles and dried blood. The atmosphere in the room was oppressive and hostile. Sarah began to hear whispers that became increasingly louder. She felt as if the voices were calling her by name, asking her to join them. Alice and Tom felt it becoming increasingly difficult to breathe with each passing minute. All three realized that this place held dark secrets that could not only answer their questions, but also take their lives. Tom, Alice, and Sarah understood that they needed to leave this place as quickly as possible. They returned to the corridor, but it seemed to have changed, as if the walls were shifting, forming new passages. Their flashlights started flickering, and they again heard the same footsteps that had stopped them in the previous part of the building. Each of their hearts was beating faster, and panic began to engulf them. Tom decided that they should go right, where there seemed to be more light. They quickly passed through a narrow passage that led them to another doorway. These doors opened into a large room with high ceilings. Old tapestries hung on the walls, and in the center stood a massive wooden table scattered with old documents and candles. The feeling that they had entered someone's sanctuary was very strong. Alice noticed an ancient book on the table that looked as if it had been recently opened. She approached and saw strange symbols on its pages. While Alice was examining the book, Tom and Sarah were trying to find another way out of the room. They heard a soft whisper coming from all sides. Suddenly, the light went out, and they were plunged into complete darkness. Tom rushed to Alice, grabbed her hand, and pulled her towards the exit. Sarah followed behind, trying to navigate in the darkness. They found a narrow staircase leading down, and without hesitation, began to descend. The stairs led them to an underground tunnel, where the air was even more humid and cold. They cautiously moved forward, listening to every sound. Suddenly, Sarah stopped and pointed at the wall, where fresh scratches were visible. It seemed that someone or something had been here recently. They continued their way, trying not to panic, although fear was increasingly gripping them. The tunnel ended in a dead end. On the wall was a metal door leading to another basement. Tom opened the door and they entered. It was a small room with stone walls and a dirt floor. Old tools and ropes lay on the floor, looking ominous. In the corner stood an old chest. Alice approached and opened it. Inside were old books and artifacts that belonged to former residents of the dormitory. Suddenly, they heard voices approaching. Tom closed the chest, and the three of them hid behind it. They watched as two shadows entered the room. These were figures in old-fashioned clothing who seemed not to notice them. The figures began a ritual using items from the chest. Tom, Alice, and Sarah realized they couldn't stay here any longer and decided to try to get out as quietly as possible. They crawled back to the door, trying not to make any noise. When they were almost at the exit, one of the figures suddenly turned and stopped, looking straight at them. All three froze, but at that moment there was a loud noise from above, and the figures vanished. Tom, Alice, and Sarah dashed for the exit, climbed the stairs, and ran out into the fresh air. They were scared and exhausted, but relieved to have escaped this terrifying place. However, when they looked back, the dormitory looked completely different, as if what they had experienced was only the beginning of a much greater horror. University campuses always have their secrets, and ours was no exception. The first disturbing signs appeared when Julia, an art student, noticed that her reflection in the mirror moved differently than she did. At first, she chalked it up to fatigue, but the events continued to repeat. One evening, she stood in front of the mirror in the dormitory bathroom and saw her reflection smile, though she herself did not. This was just the beginning of the horror. She told her friends about it, but no one took her seriously. They laughed, thinking it was just a prank or her imagination. But soon other students began experiencing similar phenomena. Mark, a physics student, said his reflection in the bathroom mirror winked at him when he did not. He began avoiding mirrors, but that didn't stop the horror. Reflections appeared even in dark windows and shiny surfaces. Lisa, a music student, heard her reflection singing a song she didn't know. They all began to realize these weren't mere coincidences. Their reflections had lives and intentions of their own. Over time, the situation became increasingly alarming. They decided to gather together and discuss it. Everyone agreed that they needed to find the cause of the strange events. They began researching the university's history and discovered that the mirrors in the old buildings were installed at the beginning of the 20th century. According to the archives, the mirrors were part of an experiment by a professor who studied paranormal phenomena. They found his notes, which stated that mirrors could be gateways to another world. This world was dark, and from it, horrible entities could penetrate. The students realized they had accidentally opened this portal and that their reflections were trying to take over. They decided to break all the mirrors in the dormitory, hoping to close the gates. Armed with hammers, they began their mission at night when most students were asleep. The first few mirrors broke easily, but with each subsequent one, the task became more difficult. The reflections began to resist, trying to stop them. In some mirrors, they saw their own faces distorted with rage and horror. They reached the last mirror, the largest, which hung in the main building's corridor. As they approached it, they all felt an invisible force pulling them back. Julia, as the mission's initiator, took responsibility and stepped forward first. She raised the hammer, but her reflection in the mirror grabbed her hand with such force that she couldn't move. Her friends rushed to help, but each of their reflections began pulling them into the mirror. They fought with all their might, but the reflections were too strong. Finally, Julia gathered all her strength and struck the mirror with the hammer. It shattered into thousands of pieces, and at that moment, everyone felt something disappear from their souls. But when they looked around, they realized they were the only ones left. All the other students had vanished, as if they had never existed. They understood that their reflections had taken over and pulled everyone else into that dark world. Left alone, they felt a deep emptiness and fear of what else might come through these mirrors. In the following days, Julia, Mark, and Lisa tried to live normal lives, but the shadows of their reflections continued to haunt them. They began seeing their faces in every reflection, every piece of glass, and it was unbearable. One day, Julia discovered a mysterious mark on her wrist that glowed in the dark. It was a symbol indicating that the connection to that world was not broken. Their lives had turned into a nightmare, and they realized this horror would never end. Julia, Mark, and Lisa decided that they needed to learn more about the professor who conducted the experiment with the mirrors. They went to the university archive, where all the old records and documents were kept. In the archive, they found Professor Johnson's notes, in which he described his research on paranormal phenomena. He was convinced that mirrors could be gateways to another dimension where dark entities lived. They also found an old photograph of the professor standing in front of a large mirror, holding an ancient book. In his notes, Professor Johnson warned about the danger of opening a portal between worlds. He wrote that mirrors could let in entities that could influence human consciousness and take over their bodies. Julia, Mark, and Lisa realized that they were dealing with something much bigger than they could have imagined. They decided to find this ancient book to learn how to close the portal. According to the notes, the book was hidden in a secret room beneath the university. They returned to the university at night when it was quiet and dark. They found the entrance to the basement mentioned by the professor in his notes. It was an old, dusty corridor that led to heavy wooden doors. They opened the doors and saw a small room filled with ancient artifacts and books. In the center of the room, on a pedestal, lay the book they were looking for. They carefully approached and picked it up. Lisa began reading aloud the incantations from the book, hoping to find a way to close the portal. But suddenly they heard whispering around them. The whispering grew louder, and they felt a chill run through their bodies. Mark noticed that their reflections in the small mirrors hanging on the walls began to move independently. The reflections approached them, distorting their faces with expressions of horror and anger. They realized that their reflections were trying to stop them from closing the portal. Julia gathered her courage and decided that they needed to break these mirrors. She grabbed the nearest object and smashed the first mirror. The shards fell to the floor and the whispering ceased for a moment. But the reflections in the other mirrors became even more aggressive. They tried to emerge from the mirrors, reaching their hands through the glass surface. Lisa continued reading the incantations, trying to find the right words to close the portal. Mark noticed that strange symbols began to glow on the room's walls. They realized this was a sign that the portal was fully open. Julia and Mark continued to break the mirrors, trying to contain the reflections. Lisa finally found the incantation and read it aloud. A strong wind rose in the room, and the light from the symbols began to flicker. The reflections screamed and disappeared one by one until none were left. When everything calmed down, they felt the weight lift from their shoulders. But it was short-lived. They realized that although they had closed the portal, something had remained with them. In every mirror, they saw their reflections, but now they knew these were not just their reflections. These were entities from another world that had now stayed with them forever. They decided to gather all the mirrors and destroy them, but they felt it was only a temporary measure. The next day, they gathered all the mirrors they could find and shattered them. But even after this, they continued to see strange things in other reflections, in puddles of water, in window glass, even in the screens of their phones. Life had turned into a nightmare, and they didn't know if they would ever be able to rid themselves of these horrors. Julia, Mark, and Lisa could not come to terms with what had happened. They understood that breaking the mirrors did not solve the problem, and were looking for other ways to get rid of the sinister reflections. One day, they found an old legend about a purification ritual that could help close the portal forever. For this, the ritual needed to be conducted at midnight in the place with the most mirrors. They decided to perform the ritual in the old Hall of Mirrors, which had been abandoned many years ago. Night came and they headed to the Hall of Mirrors. It was an old, dusty room with large mirrors on all the walls. They lit candles and laid out the artifacts from Professor Johnson's book. Lisa began reading the incantation from the book, while Julia and Mark stood around holding candles. At first, everything was calm, but then the reflections in the mirrors began to move independently. The reflections smiled ominously, and whispers started echoing in the room. The atmosphere became tense, and they felt a chill penetrate their bones. Lisa continued reading the incantation, trying to ignore the reflections. Suddenly, one of the reflections reached out a hand from the mirror and grabbed Mark. He began to scream, trying to break free, but the reflections were too strong. Julia rushed to help, but she was also grabbed by the reflections. Lisa, without stopping, read the incantation, and the mirrors began to crack. The reflections screamed and tried to break free, but the incantation held them back. When Lisa read the final words of the incantation, the mirrors exploded and shards flew across the hall. The reflections disappeared, and for a moment, there was silence. Julia and Mark lay on the floor, injured but alive. Lisa approached them and helped them up. They felt relieved, but they knew it was not over. They had managed to close the portal, but they knew they would be scarred forever. Their lives had changed forever, and they would never again be the carefree students they once were. Returning to the dormitory, they tried to live a normal life, but their memories of the horrors never faded. They knew that although the portal was closed, dark entities might find other ways to penetrate our world. They decided to continue researching paranormal phenomena to be prepared for new challenges. Life turned into a constant battle with darkness, but they knew that together they could overcome any horror. Their story became a university legend, and new students always listened with curiosity about the night the mirrors came to life.